Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 106. And just a little recap on what's been going on in the last couple issues. Swamp Thing and the Green are officially at war with Matango and the Gray. And in order to tip the scales of war into Swamp Thing's favor, he has gone on a quest for some missing elementals, specifically ones that are being held prisoner by Matango. And while he's on that journey, his wife Abby and his daughter Tefe are now hanging out in the Amazon in the Parliament of Trees. And in the last issue, there was definitely some messed up stuff that happened where Abby and Tefe went outside of the Parliament where they were protected from Matango and his forces. But we learned last week that Matango is not the only thing to be afraid of in the jungle because there were some mercenaries that were guarding a deforestation company that was coming in and clearing out all the trees in the Amazon around the Parliament's Grove. So Abby heard these sounds of machinery and yelling and stuff, and I believe gunshots. So she went out to see what was going on with Tefe and found that these mercenaries had killed all the local indigenous people that were guarding the Parliament of Trees entrance. And these mercenaries captured Abby and Tefe, and they ended up shooting Abby in the head and killing her right in front of Tefe, which was not a good idea because we got to see the manifestation of some new powers from Tefe. She basically exploded every living thing that's made of meat within a certain radius from where they were at. We're not really sure of how far it was, but we definitely saw all these mercenaries explode. We saw all the animals in the near vicinity explode, and we saw a couple villages full of people also explode. And then we also saw Tefe call forth her mom's spirit, which was now released into the spirit world. And then she made her mom a new body and put the spirit in it. So now Abby is back alive, but she's definitely traumatized by what happened. And not just the being killed part, she was more horrified by when she actually came to with her new body. She looked around, saw what Tefe had done to these people, and was super horrified by it. And that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with Swamp Thing 106, we got the cover here. We see a green Swamp Thing who's kind of surrounded by a bunch of fungal growths, and he's looking up at an even bigger growth that has a bunch of faces on it. And it looks like this growth of fungus that's white is spreading onto a green tree or something that's above. We can't really see what that is, but it's definitely more dark green on the top of the comic, and then it looks like that white is corrupting or infecting it. And Swamp Thing has kind of a stupid look on his face. I can't tell if it's awe or if it's just him being confused. And while he's looking up, we see there's like another creature that's part of this white growth that kind of looks like a fish, and it's reaching out with a clawed hand that's got red claws towards Swamp Thing like it's about to attack him. And we also see on the cover that this is the Quest for Elementals Part 3, and it is written by Doug Wheeler with art by Mike Hoffman. And we start off on the first page with a bunch of different scenes where fungus and fungal life are going crazy and out of control, not just fighting the green, but actually against people and man in general. We're seeing a rhino that was dead, that had had its horn cut off, has come back to life because the mold growth on it kind of brought it back, and it is charging some poachers that are nearby. We also see at a local fast food burger place, the mushrooms that go on the burgers are growing out of their dish and onto the meat and eating the meat. And the last scene on this page is a man who is in occupied East Jerusalem, and this man has been dead, I guess, because just like the rhino, whatever mold or fungus has been in its body grows and takes control of the body. And I'm not sure if this man is supposed to be someone in general, like if this is a pop culture thing where something was going on in Jerusalem at the time where a man died, but it kind of seems like that because it's so specific about being in East Jerusalem and whatnot. But either way, this guy climbs up on top of a spire in the town, and his body explodes with a bunch of spores, and the wind catches them, and it begins to spread through Jerusalem. And we see some narration at the end says, "In 1,000 more cities, he is soon joined by a banquet of others, their glittering seeds of corruption spreading." So it seems like this is not just going on in Jerusalem, but in other places as well. Then we cut to the Parliament of Trees with Swamp Thing, Abby, and Tefe. And Swamp Thing's getting in some daddy-daughter time. He's playing with Tefe and he's hanging out with her. He's telling her about seeds and how they work and that flowers grow from them. And as he's walking through the grove with her, he comes around a tree and sees Abby sitting on a rock. And it turns out this is a place called the Garden of Bereavement. And apparently it's the only quiet place in this grove because Abby says she can hear the trees talking to each other everywhere else. But here at least there's no whispers. It's just completely quiet. And the reason why she wants quiet is because she's having kind of like an existential crisis. So she's kind of questioning where the souls of the natives went that were killed by the mercenaries when she died as well. And as she's thinking and pondering, she looks over and sees a bunch of vines that have thorns on them. And she begins to prick her fingers until she begins to bleed. And when Swamp Thing sees this, he's like, "What are you doing?" And she looks at her hands, which have blood all over them now. And she says, "I just wanted to see if I could still bleed." And then Tefe sees the blood and says, "Hurt, Mama?" Which is her asking if Abby is hurt. And Abby has a crazy reaction to this. She pulls her hands away and says, "No, Mama's fine. Mama's perfectly fine. Nothing is wrong, Tefe. I don't need to be healed. Alec, don't let her touch me." And Swamp Thing's pretty surprised by this outburst. He says, "No one wants to hurt you. We both love you, Abby." And then Abby kind of breaks down and begins to cry and says, "I love her, Alec. It's just, Tefe frightens me now. I mean, what she did. Those butchers deserved it, Alec. I tried to push it from my mind what Tefe did to them because they deserved it. But the animals, Alec, the animals." And then we see a little flashback of what happened between the time of when Abby was still outside of the grove and with her new body and how she got back to the grove in the Parliament of Trees afterwards. Because if you remember the last issue, they just appear in the grove and I was like, how did they get back? So we find out that the Swamp Thing, who was the German World War I pilot, grew a body for himself because he is rooted in the Parliament, so he can't leave himself. But he did grow himself a body outside and was able to gather Abby and Tefe and bring them back to the grove. And he's the one who gave Tefe the toy plane that she was playing with in the last issue that I was also confused about. So as this other Swamp Thing is walking with Abby and Tefe in his arms, Abby's narration says, "And with each step, each mile, we came across dead animals, more and more. She killed them all, Alec. I didn't see a single living creature until we re-entered the Parliament, not for miles. And the more I thought about it, the more I wondered, what if there were some people in the jungle? Might Tefe have killed them too? And what if she didn't stop at the jungle? What if it didn't stop at all?" And then we get back from the flashback, and Abby is looking at Swamp Thing saying, "Did it, Alec? Did it stop? Am I the only person alive on Earth? I know I haven't been myself, but I'm still shaken from what I saw and what happened. I'm glad you've stayed by my side all this time, Alec, but it's been 6 weeks now, and you haven't spoken to me about what Tefe did at all." And then Swamp Thing looks at her with a very serious face, and he says, "Except inside the Parliament, all animal life within 22 miles of Tefe perished, including 68 species now made extinct, and 2 Brazilian townships, each containing more than 3,000 people." And then Abby looks down in horror and says, 6,000? And then she looks over at Tefe, who's having a grand old time. She's growing flowers and playing and having a blast. And Abby continues, "What are we going to do? How can we discipline her? She doesn't understand the consequences of her powers. What happens when she gets angry?" And Swamp Thing says, "She's learning to speak. We can tell her right from wrong now and hope that we are good teachers." Then we cut to a page where we get a bunch of different scenes from a bunch of different places around the world, and we're seeing how the fungus is spreading. So in the first panel, we see that it says, "In the U.S. Midwest, fields of rye explode with an invisible mutation triggered by fungal parasites. After baking, the rye becomes toxic, killing all who eat it within 48 hours. In Rio de Janeiro, a female beetle killed by the fungus inside her shivers and locks into a permanent mating position. Her unmoving corpse attracts a frenzy of males who take turns at receiving her infection." And then we get a super fucked up panel where a bunch of men that are shirtless who are standing around a body of a woman, and she is dead because the fungus is growing all over her body. And the narration relates it to the panel of the beetles above, and it says, "A second fungus cadaver plays a similar pantomime, frozen and statue-like, her attendants cavorting about her." So I guess these men are about to have sex with this woman's body, and it's going to spread the fungus to them just like it did to the male beetles above. Then we cut back to the grove in the Parliament of the Trees, and Yggdrasil is talking to Swamp Thing. He says, I have felt the movement in the soil beneath my roots. Your actions have disturbed Matango. The violence of his consciousness is penetrating the green. Aam and Kanan Cax have convinced us we need the strength of those taken prisoner during the Great Migration. And Abby and Tefe are there too, and Abby can only hear like the rustling of wind in trees while they're talking. So she says, Alec, I can't make out what they're saying. It just sounds like rustling leaves to me. And Swamp Thing says, I think they want me to resume searching for the lost Parliament members. And Abby says, I thought they were afraid that would start a war. And Swamp Thing responds saying, the war is apparently beginning anyway. Yggdrasil, my family still needs me here. And Yggdrasil says, the Grey has used these past 6 months to renew and reanimate itself. Matango's objective is to capture Tefe. Without the power of those imprisoned, we may be unable to repel him. And without even talking it over with Abby, Swamp Thing just turns to her and hands her Tefe and says, Abby, will you and Tefe be all right? And as Abby takes hold of Tefe, she says, you're going then? Yes, we'll be fine. Just hurry. So then Swamp Thing goes over to Kanan Cax, who apparently knows where the captured Parliament members are hidden. And where they're hidden is in the Himalayas. So Swamp Thing leaves and travels through the green to the Himalayan mountains. And then we cut back to more areas in the world like Paris and Metropolis. And we see the different places and ways that the fungus is spreading in those areas. But then we also cut to the Grey. And it says, in chambers of Matango's dreams, his sleepers begin to stir and stretch, awakening to new orders. So it seems like maybe Matango is aware of what Swamp Thing's doing, because on the next page we cut back to Swamp Thing, who's walking through the snow. And this part of the story is weird. I didn't quite understand it, but Swamp Thing finds some sort of plant that either he lights on fire or somehow magically bursts into fire. And then he puts it inside of his body, I guess, to keep him warm. So as he walks, the narration says, I sense a nearby presence, occupying both the earth and the green. Its nature feels similar to mine and that of the other members of the Parliament. But if its essence belongs to one of those whom I've come here to rescue from imprisonment, then why does it seem to be alone? Where are its guards and its companions? And then we see a creature walking some distance from where Swamp Thing is, and it looks like a cross between a man and a Swamp Thing. His body is made of leaves and stuff, but it definitely has a human head with a face and hair. And his body looks different than Swamp Thing's because even though he's covered in leaves and we can see those shapes, they're all white except a couple spots of green on his body. So as Swamp Thing continues to walk towards the pull of that being, he starts finding these white leaves in the snow, and they lead him into a cave. And as he walks into the cave, we see that there is a white tree with some green fruit growing on it, and around it there are fires built. And out of panel, we see someone say to Swamp Thing, I have nurtured that tree since I fled here. It's a rare white variant of the sacred bow tree, the last of its kind, just like me. And then the being comes out and faces Swamp Thing so they can see each other, and it continues, examine it, old one. My home is open. It has been many ages since a founder stopped here. And Swamp Thing asks, which founder was that? And the being says, Matango. So Swamp Thing takes him up on his offer and begins to look at the tree, and he's looking at its fruit, and as he's looking, he says, I am searching for 3 elementals, held prisoner by the Grey. I feel in your nature that you are part of the green much like myself, yet I sense no shackles around you. What are you? So the being tells Swamp Thing that he's known by many names, by many different cultures. Some of them are Yeti or Roxa. And as he's talking, he begins to lead Swamp Thing further into the cave, and we see some crazy stuff. There's like a wall of human skulls just there as they're walking by. But the being doesn't address it or anything. He just continues talking and says, mostly I was the green's reigning protector when the new created race of man, violent and destructive, gained dominion over destroying the older Neanderthal race, who had evolved in harmony with the world, and from which I myself had been born. This room is where the last of my people died 2,200 years ago. And then they walk into a room with even more skulls, and the being says, do not look at the walls yet. I must first ask permission from him who first drew our histories and prophecies upon their surface. And then this being turns to one of the skulls and says, "It is I, Otara, with the seeds of harvest. We wish to listen to the chants in your paintings." And as he's asking the skulls for permission, he reaches to his chest where there are some tubers growing, and those are the green things that were on his body. And he holds it up to the skull's mouth like it's going to eat it. And I'm not sure if it actually does or not, because in the next panel, there is no fruit anymore. So it makes it seem like the skull did eat it. And in case you didn't catch it, the being's name is Otara. So Otara pats the skull on the head and then turns to Swamp Thing and says, "The dead have conferred and given their permission." And then he begins to show Swamp Thing these cave paintings on the wall next to the skulls. And he's explaining what the pictures mean so that Swamp Thing can understand them, because they're kind of just like stick figures and random shapes that you wouldn't really be able to decipher unless you already knew the stories. So he says, "Here speaks how the fields of the earth, which had flourished with my people, have met with destruction in the wake of our genocide. Severing my roots to the parliament, I abandoned my duty to the green, and gathered those of my people whose spirits still reigned in their flesh, fleeing across these mountains and founding the final home of our tribe. We remained hidden from man's new race for thousands of years, becoming snowmen in the legends of our neighbors, until an army from the west who were crossing these mountains visited us with diseases in their breaths, bringing a plague from which none of us survived." And then Otara points to another area with different pictures on the wall, and he continues, "Over here, though, are the prophecies of the spiritual rebirth of our race, via 3 seeds given to you, and a golden cup shaped from our souls. Each seed contained our race's spirit, and the link we shared with the green and the earth. From each will grow a protector of nature, the founders of the parliament from the first 2 seeds, and a human child from the third. Tefe will join to another and start a third race, wearing the flesh of our destroyers, but containing the Neanderthal soul. Their children will supplant the parliament in its duties, and both will journey to the heavens, spreading the seeds of life." And Swamp Thing's kind of flabbergasted by all this, because these paintings are talking about his daughter, who was just born, so it's kind of blowing his mind how these people would know about her. And he asks Otara, "These paintings are speaking of my daughter Tefe?" And Otara responds, "Yes, she is the rebirth of the race which was aligned with the green, that Matango had hoped to destroy. Tefe and her descendants will increase the green's strength to a level Matango can never match. Your actions have awakened him to the fact that he must strike now if he is to ever restructure the earth in his image." And Swamp Thing asks, "How did you know my daughter's name and Matango's motivations?" And Otara says, "Come, I will show you." Then we cut back to the gray, where we see this big gray mass inside of the cave. And the gray mass is talking to a being who I actually thought was Matango himself, but apparently this big gray mass is Matango. And this gray being that we've been seeing inside the cave so far is someone the gray mass calls its tongue. So the tongue says to Matango, "Otara betrays his pledge of neutrality. He is revealing our secrets to the Green's primary founder." And Matango says, "Holland is the one whose child disturbs our slumber, whose existence threatens our vision of a reshaped fungal earth. Send some of my aspects from the Chamber of Dreams to the nightmare world above us." And then we see 3 beings get released. One of them looks like a fungal version of Swamp Thing. He's kind of humanoid and has the same face and everything, but he's more gray, and he has like mushrooms growing off of him. One looks like a giant fat fish that looks like it should probably be in the water, but somehow it's on land. And the last one looks like a fish-faced person, but it definitely has arms and legs. And all of them have fungus growing off of them. And Matango says to them, "Otara and his guests must be joined to the gray, subdued by all of our will." And then we cut back to Swamp Thing and Otara in the cave. And Otara has taken him to this very interesting looking plant. It kind of looks like the Epcot Center in Disneyland, except it's not white, but it is in the shape of a golf ball. And where the divots would be on the golf ball, there's windows that we can see into this plant, and it looks like it's filled with some kind of gray liquid. So Otara introduces Swamp Thing to this thing and says, "This is the ever-shifting Chang Arka, a construct of globes within globes within globes. Like the earth, its surface belongs to the green, while its innermost layer is solidly gray. In between, the two struggle in a ballet of fungi and plants. By meditating upon these inner gyrations, one may witness the intrigues of the two worlds of life. And Swamp Thing looks at it and asks, what keeps it in motion? And Otara answers, the green elementals occupy the core, trapped like Gaia within the earth. The Chang Arka is their prison. The constant shifting of the layers of vegetation and fungi is created by the efforts of those inside to escape, and the gray to hold them fast within. And Swamp Thing kind of looks closer into that liquid, into the gray, and he sees some faces that are green. So I'm assuming that this is the prison that's holding the three elementals that Swamp Thing is looking for. And he asks Otara, you have studied the prison for thousands of years and done nothing to help those inside? And Otara looks at him and answers, I promised Matango to remain neutral in the conflict, in return for his allowing me to save a handful of my people, keeping them hidden within these caves. And then he points to a spot on his back and says, this spot of fungus dormant on my back is the guarantee of our agreement. And then we cut to the outside of the cave where we see the three attributes of Matango coming up to the surface from the snow, and there's like a goat that is waiting by a tree, and it seems like they enter this goat and fungus begins to grow all over its body. And then we cut back into the cave where Otara is saying, before you attempt to free them, let me tell you what I've learned of the gray. And Swamp Thing asks, why can't it wait? And Otara answers, because afterwards I may not be able to tell you. The key to comprehending the ways of the gray is to understand the methods of its replication and feeding. These are the two primal functions which drive all life forms and determine their path of logic. The gray adds to itself by absorbing its prey, taking possession of its hosts rather than eating them. It changes the cells of its victims from their old forms to fungus, their corpses merely becoming new limbs in Matango's body. Matango's elementals, who are extensions of him, manifest on Earth by taking over the living. They are unable to grow new bodies from scratch, but must instead possess another's and convert its form to the gray. The gray is a collective consciousness, even more so than the Parliament. Within it, individuality is subdued and dispersed, all parts answering to the greater whole. Matango may be the gray's ruler, but he is simultaneously its slave, only because his will is stronger than that of the others the gray has absorbed. This is why some elementals were made prisoners, rather than be consumed, because Matango was not ready to subdue all their wills. The weaker ones, though, he absorbed into the gray in order to build his own version of the Parliament. The gray is incapable of conceiving its own elementals, and so must steal the greens and transform them. And as he says this last line, we see the aspects of Matango hatching from the goat outside. So it seems that these three are probably elementals from the Parliament that have been corrupted and taken over by Matango. So Otara continues talking to Swamp Thing and says, tell me, Alec Holland, does Ysigdrael still bear the wound which Matango gave him in the Battle of Eden? And Swamp Thing answers, yes, one of his two helix trunks is completely rotted with fungus. So I think I've said it before, but Ysigdrael looks like a DNA strand, so it's like a double helix going up. And I never really noticed it before Swamp Thing said this, but one of the strands in that helix is gray, so I guess it's been corrupted by fungus. And Swamp Thing continues, he has managed, though, to keep it from spreading, and it does not seem to affect him. And Otara says, doesn't it? Are you sure? Ysigdrael's fungus half occupies the gray, and therefore is part of Matango's body. Whatever Yggdrasil knows, so too does Matango. And Swamp Thing is very alarmed by this information, and he says, if that's true, then Matango knows of my journey here, and all of the other missions of rescue the Parliament sent out as well. And then Otara gets a weird tick where I guess his tree in the other room is alerting him that the three aspects of Matango are coming in the cave. And he doesn't tell Swamp Thing though, he just says, if you wish to try to release those inside the Chang Arka, hurry, do so now. So Swamp Thing looks at the globe, and like Otara explained before, the stuff inside is constantly moving and it's never static. So Swamp Thing has to maneuver his arm around when he reaches in, trying not to touch the gray and reaching towards the beings trapped inside. And while Swamp Thing is doing this, Otara is giving him some tips, helping him guide his arm around the gray.
But then all of a sudden, Otara's voice cuts out, and this causes Swamp Thing to falter, and he's unable to grab the beings inside as he pulls back his arm, and we see that his arm is now totally withered and covered with fungus. And then Swamp Thing turns around and he sees the three aspects just standing there, and there's actually a fourth aspect in the room now who is a bird that has been corrupted, and it is sitting on top of the globe. And it says to Swamp Thing, "Your hand, it pecks where it should not." And Swamp Thing responds, "They were not yours to take." And then the other three respond to Swamp Thing saying, "You forget, younger brother, they were ours by treaty, a treaty the Parliament has now broken, with their attempts to free those we have not yet converted." And while they're talking, we see that one of them has Otara in its arms, and he says, "We are Matango's fingers, his hand to command, and he wishes to catch the guarantee this one pledged." And as he says this, the one that has Otara pokes one of its fingers into Otara's back where the fungus patch was, and Otara's body begins to completely dissolve and explode. And as it's exploding, he says to Swamp Thing, "Worry not of me, for I have long meditated and prepared for this moment. One needs find the spot which cannot be moved." And before he can finish what he was saying to Swamp Thing, his body completely dissolves. And the aspects say to Swamp Thing, "His soul tumbers down to the chamber of dreams. It is time, Brother Holland, that you join him." And then all four of them jump on Swamp Thing and force him into the globe. And once they enter, they say to him, "Sleep now. You'll be taken to a spot where we are consolidating those not yet absorbed. Many were captured today. The Parliament's rescue missions have nearly all failed. We knew of them in advance." And Swamp Thing asks, "You knew? How?" And they answer him, "The roots that we sleep among whispered the news to us. But you no longer need be concerned with thoughts of the green again. Tomorrow the Parliament will be no more." And then we get a panel of a bunch of corrupted Parliament elementals that are walking towards the grove in the Parliament of Trees. And that is the end of the issue. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.